登壇者のご紹介です。From AWE COO and Content Director, Mr. David Weeks. Mr. David Weeks, please start.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So my pleasure to join everyone here today. My name is David Weeks. I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of AWE Asia, which stands for the Augmented World Expo. Big thank you to Shun, Sumir, and the entire Magora team. Really a delight to join XR Kaigi today. We at AWE Asia, we are a conference dedicated to connecting XR professionals around the APAC region, so including South Asia as well as Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and Northeast Asia. Our conference has been running since 2015. We're part of the Augmented World Expo's global network. I don't know if you've heard of AWE, but AWUSA was one of the first XR conferences or XR industry conferences ever hosted. Our first US conference was hosted in 2009, back when XR was certainly a very nascent industry. So anyways, for our talk today, our discussion topic today is sourcing deals in Japan's near abroad, opportunities for Japanese XR companies to expand into other Asian markets. So in transparency, if you're here with a large enterprise, you come from a large enterprise context, then perhaps some of this stuff may be a bit simple or a bit perfunctory. I think that for some of you who, I imagine that, given that our industry is a new one, that some of you are probably coming from more of a startup background. So I think I'll try to sort of orient my focus around companies that are somewhat newer and companies who have a bit of, who have an established presence or have a series of successful products and client relationships here in Japan that are looking to expand into countries in Japan's near abroad, places like Korea, China, Malaysia, and Singapore. So in terms of our agenda today, first I'll talk about some key trends that we've observed at AWE Asia based on the sessions that are shared in our conference and the exhibits that we've seen at our conference. Some key trends in the broader Asia-Pacific region. Then I'll do a deep dive on a couple of country-specific markets. So in particular, we'll talk a little bit about the XR industry and the ecosystem in China, Malaysia, and Singapore. From there, I'll talk about some common pitfalls that I've seen certain companies in Northeast Asian markets making when they try to pivot from a domestic orientation to an international orientation. So one, examples being Chinese and Korean companies and Japanese companies who are successful in their home markets, but when they pivot to an international country rollout where they have to sort of duplicate all of their international marketing assets, creating English language websites, English language mock-ups of products, English language promotional videos, some things that might go wrong. From there, some pieces of advice on expansion and then some conclusions and key takeaways. So, industry-wide, the Asia-Pacific region is the second largest of the sort of global regions for the XR market. However, it is the fastest growing. The total market size there are different methodologies for measuring it. This data comes from a market research firm called Report Ocean, which appraises that or estimates that the XR market in the Asia-Pacific region will be worth $288 billion by 2026. That would be a 40% compound annual growth rate looking from 2021 through 2026 in the Asia-Pacific region. The North American market is bigger, but the Asia-Pacific region is consistently growing faster. And overall, the potential impact of the broader sort of metaverse and metaverse industries on overall economic output is, if we sort of assume that the overall GDP the GDP contributions of the metaverse and metaverse-related businesses to total GDP would be about 1.3 to 2.4%. So some key qualitative trends that we're seeing. So first, a lot of the growth trends and the sort of growth numbers that we've talked about just now very much are influenced by the pace of growth in China. So we can speak a little bit about some of the trends that sort of, that we can extrapolate regionally, and then we can dive into a couple of country-specific trends. So first, I think that one of the most obvious sort of gateway issues for the expansion of the metaverse and the sort of trajectory in the Asia-Pacific region is the hard infrastructure that enables the metaverse, right? So 5G 5G and 6G technologies. So in the Asia-Pacific region, countries like China and Japan are progressing towards a 6G future at a faster rate than many other countries in the region. I think that it was only maybe 3 or 4 years ago that we heard about how China was building 5G base stations at a rate that was ever accelerating. At one point, China had built more 5G base stations than the rest of the world combined. So I think the telco infrastructure is very important. I think that as XR, as VR and MR sort of applications become more and more sophisticated, and as content becomes richer, this does kind of require that internet speeds be able to, to support those experiences, particularly because of the limitations of local computing on XR headsets and XR devices. Much more of the sort of computing that would be happening has to take place in the cloud. But of course, that means that we need faster internet connections in order to support that. Beyond that, there's also government support for metaverse strategies. So I think that we can extrapolate or sort of infer a couple of different fact patterns as far as how different countries have metaverse industries have benefited or not benefited from government support. So I'd say that the most sort of, I think that there's perhaps 3 different sort of fact patterns. The first is where there's just no government support whatsoever. The government may have certain procurement projects, or there might be particular government agencies or bureaus that buy things from XR companies, but there is no comprehensive national strategy. I think probably the best example of this is what's happening in the US. The US has absolutely no national strategy. There is no industrial policy governing the metaverse. The US Army makes purchases of Microsoft HoloLens. Fine. The Navy doesn't talk to them, right? There isn't even within the Department of Defense, there isn't a specific strategy towards the metaverse, much less the United States federal government more broadly speaking. I think that there are some other countries in the Asia-Pacific region, though, where that's also true, right? So we haven't really seen a lot of public policy leadership from places like Indonesia or places like the Philippines. There is, but on the other hand, you do have sort of, industrial policy regarding, say, fintech or, other things where the government is sort of interested in inculcating and incubating a local scene there. But we don't really see that, we don't really see an XR-specific or metaverse-specific national strategy. So category 1, no strategy whatsoever. 2, I would say, is a strategy that's specifically focused on hardware or on the production of stuff. I'd say that the best example of this would be China. So China, as part of the most recent 5-year plan that was announced by, and promulgated by Xi Jinping 2 years ago, said that there is a specific production target for China for XR headsets. So the Ministry of Information Technology, MIIT in China, said that the national goal is for China to produce and to manufacture at least 25 million XR headsets by the end of 2026. Now, that sounded really reasonable in 2023, but now we're getting pretty close to 2026, and it sort of remains to be seen whether or not they will meet that target. Of course, by not defining the words XR headset in very specific terms, one could maybe move the methodology a little bit and say, this particular smartphone peripheral is an XR device, right? We'll see if they change the definition there. But for right now, we can say that there is a particular strand of public policy support that is oriented around the production of physical items, the manufacture of specific of specific numbers of headsets, right? So you can call that, I guess, the production target strategy. And then you have national strategies that are more oriented around fostering an ecosystem with the explicit goal of fostering economic activity and in particular promoting employment. I'd say that the most classical example of this is probably South Korea. So South Korea has a number of initiatives that are announced by, that are promulgated by the national government there that have specific economic growth objectives in mind. So there are no production targets for the numbers of headsets made or anything like that, but there is a sort of national system or national strategy oriented around the metaverse. So there's a couple of strands there. The broader context is that as part of the prior Korean government before the current ones, so the last prime minister of South Korea announced this policy called the Digital New Deal. So there was sort of a wide sort of sense of awareness that a number of industries are facing technological disruption. This will probably increase and continue with the sort of industrial transformations taking place with artificial intelligence. So as there is job displacement and dislocation taking place, it's necessary for the government to step in to help to create jobs of the future and to make sure that those jobs of the future are in this case, South Korea. So as part of the Digital New Deal, one of the sort of pieces of that was a series of initiatives oriented around expanding support for the metaverse. So in particular, the South Korean government has 3 or 4 different publicly funded investment investment opportunities that companies can apply for. So in total, there's about $200 million in South Korea that's available for different companies to apply for public funding. Some of that is a sort of public-private partnership where the government contributes some, the private sector contributes some are entirely publicly controlled initiatives. In addition, there is quite a lot of funding for that comes from public procurement. And in particular, what we've seen is that you have sort of classic consumer demographics like universities, defense departments, local police departments, other sort of typical consumers of XR. But what we've seen from South Korea that I think is interesting is the Seoul city government has sort of taken an approach of trying to sort of more holistically purchase, acquire, and implement metaverse solutions and strategies to questions or sort of issues that are public goods. So you might have heard of this sort of initiative from late 2023, where the city of Seoul tried to create basically a metaverse through which certain public services are administered. So if your driver's license was about to expire, you could basically access it through a sort of a Roblox-like interface and apply to renew your driver's license online in sort of like a metaverse sort of 2D digital sort of virtualized world. So that's all to say that rather than sort of making these purchases according to each individual sort of department of the city government, we sort of saw a sort of a citywide approach to and a citywide sort of vision of what a sort of a digital soul sort of approach to the metaverse looks like. Finally, there's been support from the from NEPA, which is the National IT Promotion Agency, which is a division of the National ICT Ministry in South Korea. So what NEPA has been doing is pretty interesting. Basically, their explicit sort of goal is to facilitate the export of Korean IT products. So there are particular initiatives in South Korea now that are oriented around where their explicit KPI is not the production of goods or the creation of jobs, but rather the export of a certain sort of dollar value or Korean won value of metaverse products. So NEPA, through its initiative called the K-Metaverse, has been going to different international conferences around the world. It's usually a pavilion of about 6 or 8 different companies. So they've gone to conferences like AWE, AWE Asia, CES, North Star Dubai, different places like that. And their explicit goal is to facilitate meetings and ultimately to facilitate the export of Korean-made metaverse products. So I think that we can say that this third approach basically is stimulating employment or stimulating economic activity, but without really like an attention to or a sensitivity to the manufacture of physical goods. So I think that these are some different sort of patterns and threads of public sector support that we can identify across the entire region. Third, I think one challenge that we've experienced in the APAC region is that AR glasses, AR and to a lesser degree MR sort of helmets, if you will, have experienced some challenges in recent years. I think that in 2022, before the pandemic, we saw at AWE Asia, we saw quite a lot of excitement about AR glasses. We had companies like Lenovo, Xiaomi, Oppo, Huawei, Hisense. All of these companies were making glasses that kind of looked like the Qualcomm XR2 reference design, right? So these were sort of glasses that kind of looked like the Ray-Ban Wayfarer. There were cameras on the sides, right? And I think that there was a story that we sort of heard as an industry that this has the potential to enter the consumer market. I think that we've seen that probably most prominently with Meta's Ray-Ban device. However, in major Asian markets, this product has not been launched. It's not available. It's, I think, primarily a US product. So particularly in China and in other countries in Japan's near abroad, what we've seen is that there has been this promise of a consumer-ready AR device that hasn't really materialized. We can talk about some reasons for why that's true, but what we've seen is that basically we've gotten sort of, sort of a flood of pretty similar AR headsets, and then we have in parallel to that true MR headsets like those made by Microsoft, the HoloLens, as well as the Rokid MR device. We've seen that those have encountered a different set of challenges. They were never really purported to be consumer-facing devices. But now that Microsoft has announced that it's stopping, that it's terminating the HoloLens product line, it's no longer going to be making new HoloLens devices, that has kind of left Rokid as one of the few sort of true MR makers in the APAC region. And I think that it has sort of brought to the fore this broader question of whether or not the technology and consumer demand and appetite is ready for smart glasses, or if maybe that is a farther future possibility. In the meantime, though, it seems like between Quest 3 and Apple Vision Pro, we're very much in this world of mobile AR for consumers and pass-through VR or pass-through MR, right? Something that is ultimately a VR headset, but with pass-through MR capabilities. That is essentially the status quo of enterprise XR as far as the hardware interface goes. Another trend that we've seen, it has to do with the supply chain and high-end manufacturing. So we've seen a bit of a sort of a competition inside of Asian markets as to who is going to be the leader of not just XR sort of finished headsets that are ready for enterprise or consumer purchase, but of the input components that go inside of them. So we're seeing that there is competition both at the level of controllers, of optics, gyroscopes, chipsets, all of these sort of pieces. I'd say that the central challenge, particularly the one that relates, I think, most closely to number 3, is the content ecosystem. So as it stands right now, there are a couple of content ecosystems that are available to users in Asia, but we still really struggle with these persistent problems around interoperability across hardware environments. So even if you're making stuff for Meta headsets, making sure that they work between Quest 2, Quest 3, that they're optimized for both. But then, of course, we have, compared to North America or the EU, we do have a much more fragmented ecosystem here in the Asia-Pacific region. China largely relies on its domestic headset makers, so you're much more likely to see DPVR or Huawei headsets or those made by domestic producers. You're much more likely to see stuff made by Microsoft and Meta and HTC in Singapore, and you just have a much more fragmentation across both brands and across technical sort of coding environments and operating systems in Asia. So I'd say, in other words, that we, in the Asia-Pacific region, we really struggle with interoperability more so than some of the other regions in the world. Now, of course, making that even more challenging is that many Chinese companies prefer to purchase, or they may even, if they're public sector, they may have a requirement that they purchase from a Chinese manufacturer. But in parallel to that, one thing that I think makes this question of sort of the content ecosystem of standard setting and of interoperability even harder is that many app stores that exist in China have pretty onerous regulations surrounding them, right? So China also regulates content that's produced on, say, the iPhone App Store, or that's produced on their version of the Google Play Store. It has quite strict regulations, particularly those surrounding video games. So if there's a chance that a young person, someone under 18, might consume that content, or if that content has any connection to the teaching of history or of politics or something like that, it does get quite complicated in China. So in other words, compliance reasons as well as practical reasons sort of accelerate that fragmentation and lack of interoperability and cross-device compatibility in China and in the APAC region more broadly. So at AWE Asia, we ask everyone at the start of the conference, over the next 2 years, what do you think our prospects are as an industry? How excited are you about the future of the XR industry? So we asked people on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, naturally, this is an XR conference. So, I hope that no one says 0, right? Like, I certainly hope that people aren't, fundamentally pessimistic about the industry that they're involved in. But what we see at AWE Asia is that people are deeply optimistic over the 2-year horizon about the future of the industry. There is fewer than 10%, or excuse me, fewer than 15% of people that have given a 7 or below. So most people think that that the prospects are an 8 out of 10 or better for the future of the industry. So we'll talk a little bit about some more sort of demographics and a bit more of a deep dive about AWE Asia's community here in a bit. But let's dive into some country-specific details now. So for China, the reason I'll start with China first because I think it's one of the more complicated regions. It also just happens to be quite large. And practically, we have hosted AWE Asia for a couple of years in China, so have a bit more of experience dealing with that market. So the XR market in China is changing rapidly. That is fueled and motivated by government support, which we just discussed, those production targets for XR headsets. We're also seeing different levels of adoption across large-scale enterprise settings, particularly those in education, healthcare, and entertainment. I do think that those create some opportunities for Japanese companies to expand into China. So China's overall VR and AR market revenue, using the same sources that I had previously described at the start of the session, is valued at $8.2 billion for 2024. And the revenue is expected to have a CAGR of 8% by 2029, reaching $12 billion. So that is the largest, similar to many other places in Asia, the largest sort of subsegment of revenue in the XR industry in China is VR hardware, followed by AR software. So as far as fundraising goes, China's been a major player in the global XR and the global XR and metaverse ecosystem. Some of its top tech giants and investment firms have been channeling additional revenue or additional resources into the metaverse in recent years. It has been a leader in XR hardware. So in this sort of goal to ship 25 million headsets by 2026, we have seen a number of companies step in recently. So there are sort of companies that sell globally, like Lenovo. Lenovo recently worked with Qualcomm to create the reference design for the XR2 headset. So it's not an accident that a Chinese company ultimately created the reference design for a global chipset manufacturer. There's also Pico. I think that we've heard in recent years that Pico has had sort of a mixed bag of experiences. Pico, at the start of the pandemic, sort of anticipated that there would be very explosive and rapid growth in its consumer-facing segments, particularly in VR gaming. And it seems like their sales numbers haven't met their expectations as much. So last year, Pico did do a number of layoffs that sort of limited the size of their global team. But all the same, Pico does still remain one of the largest players in China. In addition to that, there's DPVR and ETE, as well as Xiaomi. So Xiaomi is going to be introducing, or they have just introduced, a new range of smart glasses in 2026. So you have basically all of the major tech giants of China either announcing XR headsets or that they would like to sort of go into some kind of software or creator ecosystem. The VR App Store landscape in China, however, is probably the most fragmented in all of the Asia-Pacific region. So there is I'd say that the local player that probably has the most robust app store is the Pico store. Pico has put a good amount of money into working with global content creators, people who publish on Valve, on HTC, the Vive store, or on the Meta Quest store, to basically paying them to localize their content and to translate sort of character dialogues, UI, UX, menu buttons, all that good stuff, translating those from English into Chinese. So there has been a sort of a creator fund for Pico specifically. In recent years, before, a couple of years ago, there was another company called Movision, which was an ODM supplier for many of the DPVR headsets. Movision had a similar sort of a similar program where developers would get paid to localize their content from their home language, most often English, but it's not sort of exclusively English, but most often localizing from the host language or their home language into Chinese, and then allowing them to publish the app in their Chinese app stores. Those initiatives have quieted down in recent years. I think that a lot of that has been driven by the slow growth of XR and particularly VR headsets in the consumer segment in China. Our read on this is that there will be a day for consumer VR in China. It's just not now. It hasn't happened yet. I think one of the major reasons for this is that the Chinese economy is struggling compared to how it was doing in 2019. Households have spent, and sort of worked their way through a lot of their savings. The economy is growing much slower than it has in recent years. Other sort of major stores of value that people have, like stocks, access to international equities markets, is limited in China. And at the same time, property values have been declining since the sort of supply chain shocks of 2022 took place in China. So because of that, the economy isn't doing as well. And for a Chinese family, a VR headset is a pretty significant expense. It's not viewed as a vital expense in the same way that a laptop computer is. So we've seen that there's been this perception that VR headsets in particular are sort of like a luxury product that people don't necessarily need. So that's sort of some of the context for what we're seeing for why consumer VR hasn't really had its day in China, although there are companies who are trying to establish a sort of a basis for themselves to create the ecosystem and to create an architecture for being able to promote and push content through an app store and an app ecosystem. But we're not there yet. So some events and conferences that I think are interesting if you're interested in China would be, I think that the largest sort of B2B conference in China, is the World Conference on the Virtual Reality and Immersive Tech, or WCVRI. I think that it was previously called the World Conference on the Virtual Reality Industry. Curiously, it's hosted in this second-tier city in China called Nanchang, which is the capital of Jiangxi province. Kind of an unlikely place for a major sort of global VR conference to be hosted, but it's been in Nanchang ever since 2016, so it is sort of a fixture of the local ecosystem. Every year, China does announce a top 50 XR companies or top 50 VR companies at this event. So particularly if you're interested in government-to-government cooperation or with people who are sort of upstream in the XR supply chain, this is, I think, an important event. Of course, AWE Asia has a history of hosting in China. We hosted our conference in China from 2015 until 2022. We were actually the only XR conference to host offline for all 3 years of COVID. We've also, sort of have our roots in China and have a good number of folks who, even though our conference is in Singapore now, a good number of folks who join our event from China as well. So some considerations when expanding into China. First, collaborating with Chinese manufacturers like Pico or Xiaomi usually often requires that you bundle, in order to cooperate with particularly large companies like this, there is often an expectation that you bundle hardware with content. Like I was talking about before, a lot of these companies don't have a particularly sophisticated content ecosystem. So being able to partner with one of these companies does kind of beg the question of who is paying for the cost of localizing from Japanese into Chinese. So I think that the structure of the partnership there is particularly important. However, I think that there are some reasons to be excited about expanding into China. In particular, there is quite a strong demand for Japanese IP. I think that the both film, TV, and sort of print media in Japan is quite popular in China. People enjoy dramas and sort of pop music that's produced here. Obviously, the Pokemon series, other sort of video game titles are very popular in China. So I think that Japan has a couple of sort of core strengths when approaching the Chinese market. China doesn't really have the same, I'd say that the sort of top gaming IPs in China just don't quite have the same level of popular awareness and don't have the same cultural muster that they do as compared to their Japanese counterparts. So I think that Japan does have some core strengths as far as consumer entertainment and titles that would be interesting there. So let's pivot over to Singapore. So Singapore is a very small market, but it is a big gateway. So Singapore is, the reason that we host a conference in Singapore is not because the local Singapore market is such a large place. It's a small city. If you put it in China, it wouldn't even be in the top 100 cities in China, or it wouldn't be in the top 25, excuse me. But Singapore is an ideal gateway for expanding into the broader APAC region for a couple of reasons. If you're interested in meeting companies in China, it's a nice sort of middle ground that's neutral. It's a Chinese-speaking place. People from China feel welcome there. On the other hand, it doesn't, there is sort of a much better sense of the rule of law there. Contracts are a little bit more enforceable. If you have particularly sensitive IP that's part of like a partnership with a Chinese company, you probably do have much more robust legal protections in Singapore. But there's beyond the sort of the China axis, Singapore is often a great place that people choose to go if you're interested in working with companies in Southeast Asia, or if you're interested in sort of, if you haven't quite decided if whether or not your international expansion strategy might involve a bit of South Asia as well. Singapore is kind of convenient for everyone. Practically, it's also quite nice from a visa perspective because most of your, the countries that you're going to be selling to in this area or either have visa waivers or have like a very rationalized approach for applying for visas to Singapore. So we really like hosting events there. I do think that if you have a sort of a developers conference or are interested in hosting meetups for developers in the region, I do think that Singapore is a pretty nice place to host. As far as its local revenue, Singapore's AR and VR market revenue was valued at 150 million in 2024, so a fraction the size of the entire region or of a bigger market like China or Japan. The revenue is expected to grow at about the same pace as what we saw in China, VR hardware being the largest subset. Some trends that we've seen in Singapore that I think are interesting, though, is first, Singapore, we don't really associate it with being a giant manufacturing hub in the same way that, somewhere like Vietnam or China is. But there have been some really interesting developments in the industrial metaverse in Singapore. In particular, Siemens recently announced in CES 2024, Siemens announced that they were going to be basically not only implementing an industrial metaverse sort of approach with a new plant that they were building in Singapore, but that this was going to actually be a sort of a product that they were going to bring to market. So, kind of inculcating this product internally and then rolling it out as a sellable product to other manufacturers around the world. So this involves, as far as we understand, some of the details are sort of, still in the process of being discussed and developed. So what's public and available about this is pretty limited. But essentially, this would involve, extensive sort of creation of 3D models and a quite intricate digital twin of this environment, of this manufacturing environment at their Singapore lab, and the deployment and use of augmented reality and mixed reality for employee training and onboarding as people begin to work in this facility. We've also seen sort of some similar news from the biotech company GSK. So GlaxoSmithKline is going to be producing or will be creating a new vaccine plant in Singapore that they've recently broke ground last year. So in other words, we don't think of Singapore as a giant manufacturing hub, but there is some interesting innovations happening in the industrial metaverse in Singapore right now. The other thing that I think, one other thing that I think is interesting is the particular ways that Singapore is is allowing public sector organizations to take the lead in developing and piloting AR and VR for employee training and for safety training in particular. So Singapore's Metro, for any of the sort of new people who are coming into into the organization who would like to be operators or drivers of subway cars, Singapore's Metro system actually does most of that training in VR first. So you have a sort of a low-stakes digital sort of training experience first before people are actually put behind the wheel of a moving train car. We've also seen the Singapore police force do some interesting work in using virtual and augmented reality for police training, and in particular for the training of special forces, as well as for people who are going to be piloting boats for their Coast Guard. So similar sort of story, I'd say. You have another public sector organization in Singapore allowing people to do training in a VR environment first, experiencing that through a low-stakes digital simulation of what they'll be driving or what they'll be piloting, with the in-person stuff happening later. Some other government initiatives that I think are interesting is the Singapore Tourism Board collaborated with Google Maps to create the world's first the first location-based AR experiences native to Google Maps. And that kind of expands on or riffs on a previous sort of bit of news that we saw in 2022 when the Singapore Land Authority worked with a private company to create the world's first country-scale digital twin. Of course, that's kind of cheating a little bit because Singapore is a city-sized country, right? So it's a lot easier to say we're a country-sized digital twin when your country is a city. But still, they do have the title of having the first country-scale digital twin. Speaking of the Land Authority and sort of folks involved in architecture and land management, the Building and Construction Authority is also using AR and digital twins in urban planning and building projects. And in particular, the Building and Construction Authority has a sort of a centralized training academy that it uses to train a lot of public sector architects and urban planners. And the use of AR and VR is now sort of baked into the curriculum, where anyone who graduates from the Building and Construction Authority's Academy experiences several modules that are taught in AR and VR. There's also some other public sector organizations, particularly museums like the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore, that are using basically, that have permanent installations that are VR native, right? So there is a VR room or set of rooms, a VR gallery in the ACM, and that content is just rotating on a, as the exhibit changes. So we kind of go from having VR being a bell or a whistle on an existing, on one particular exhibit, where VR comes into that space, as opposed to there being a dedicated XR space in a museum with that content rotating as the exhibit changes. There's also been some other innovations that I'd say are a little bit more on the consumer-facing side of things in Singapore. So L'Oreal introduced an AR-powered, they called it an AR-powered metaverse, but really I think it was just a much larger and more sophisticated try before you buy sort of initiative, but it was very heavily promoted in Singapore. And L'Oreal's sort of Asia-Pacific HQ is in Singapore. So I think that was interesting. Capital Land is one of the largest sort of real estate management and investment groups in Singapore. They had announced that they were creating this this thing called the Capitaliverse, which was basically a virtual world hosted inside of Roblox that was sort of like a simulation or a model of many of Capital Land's properties. Remains to be seen how many users they got, but definitely an interesting example of a large sort of real estate and an architecture firm sort of embracing that metaverse hype from a couple of years ago. I'd say that the biggest bit of news that we saw in Singapore on the consumer end of things, though, was McDonald's announcing that they were creating, essentially they were using NFTs, but they sort of framed this as a sort of a larger metaverse play, that they were using NFTs to engage customers and to give people basically digital rewards. So instead of having that sort of old version of like a QR code that gives you a certain number of points if you shop at McDonald's often, that they're going to be using NFTs as a way to encourage consumer loyalty. That was something that only took place in July of this past year. So I think that's kind of interesting, right? Because that was a good 2 years after that sort of peak metaverse hype took place, where people were talking about minting NFTs left and right, and I think that only 6 months ago was well past that hype. So I thought that was kind of interesting that McDonald's chose to do that so late in the sort of the hype cycle. I think that a lot of folks had sort of were surprised to hear that. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops. The last thing I'll point out here is that Niantic launched the Scaniverse 4 product at AWE Asia 2024. So that product that I think many of you guys are experiencing now, it is really interesting, particularly how Niantic is using the Gaussian splat technique to gather and render the physical environment around you. That product did launch at AWE Asia in Singapore in 2024. So as far as some trends that we saw in Malaysia, I'd say that the main takeaway here is that the vast majority of XR use cases that we've observed in Malaysia, based on the conference sessions that were delivered at AWE Asia, were in the industrial metaverse, and in particular in oil and gas exploration. Most notably, a lot of activity coming from Petronas and different subsidiaries of Malaysia's sort of oil and gas industry. It seems like one of the biggest trends that we saw with that was workplace safety training, and in particular, fairly simple to implement applications that were focused on preventing people from dropping things. So employees physically dropping items that were physically heavy or that involved sort of, a misoperation of a crane or something like that. So fairly simple safety initiatives that were being sort of used in the oil and gas exploration space in Malaysia. So the government agency in Malaysia called MDEC does support the XR industry in a number of different ways. They host this festival called Immerse KL. Usually that takes place in October of every year. Last year there was also an announcement that there's going to be new tax breaks for companies that are in the XR space. So as far as I want to be respectful of time, so we'll just go ahead and move on here. So I think that some pieces of advice that we have for XR companies here in Japan, if you're interested in expanding overseas. I think the most important thing is to invest in media relations, and in particular to recognize that the most important news sources here in Japan aren't necessarily the most influential news sources overseas. That the news sites that you may be getting coverage in here in Japan may not be publishing those articles in English. So if you're getting what is like a real win as far as PR goes in Japan, that's really agnostic as to how that shows up on the English language internet. So I think it's really important to make sure that your news stories and that are sort of that are reporting your successes, that those get repeated in English somehow, some way, even if that's simply translating it, PDFing it, posting that as a press release or something on your website. I think that one thing that I've seen when we've done different sort of sponsorships and partnerships from companies in Japan that's been a challenge is that you'll create an English language website or an English language version of your pitch PowerPoint presentation, and that often doesn't get updated at the same frequency as your domestic comms does. So making sure that taking stock at least once a month to make sure that your PowerPoint, that is your international focused PowerPoint, is current and reflects the status quo of your new products. Now that sounds kind of obvious, but if you're in a startup environment, everyone can probably maybe sympathize with this. Products change constantly because you get more traction in one space as opposed to another. So you're constantly sort of re-optimizing your products. One last thing I'll point out here is testimonials. So I think that testimonials really have to, and case studies. I think that particularly as a startup, these are vitally important. I think oftentimes they don't tell your story quite as well as they could in your native language, right? So your case studies might be really good if you're doing well domestically, you're working with, like a major tech giant in Japan, or one of a local government, or a big university or something like that, those don't necessarily mean that that story has the same resonance overseas. So if it's maybe a big national champion company or an important government agency, when you tell the story of that case study overseas, I think it's really important to offer a little bit more context to the reader on why that company is important, why that case study mattered. And in particular, to state not just that we worked with the Air Force here in Japan, or that we worked with an important or influential university, but what you actually did. Sort of what was the problem that you identified, the value you articulated, and any measurable outcomes that you can point out. I think that that's often stuff that you're probably doing in Japanese, but I think it's really key to make sure that that's taking place in English as well. So kind of speaking to, in a similar way, that sort of having international press as part of your international case studies as part of how you show up overseas. So I think a lot of this is fundamentally a question of how you show up on Google, how you're visible to overseas visitors, and people who ultimately want to sanity check you as an organization. So if this sounds interesting, if you're interested in expanding to countries in Japan's near abroad or near Japan, we would encourage you to check out AWE Asia. I think that it's fair to say XR Kaigi is one of the leading conferences in Japan. We aspire to be that for Southeast Asia, and sort of to acting as a bridge between Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and South Asia. So I think that you would be in good company at AWE Asia. Here are our dates for 2025, as well as our USA in EU conferences. We welcome people from across different regions. You can see here our demographics, and from across many different sort of silos of the XR industry, including people who are end users, customers of your services, as well as developers and platforms. So with that said, if you have any questions, I would be happy to speak to those. I do want to be respectful that we're at time right now, so I'd be happy to chat outside. Otherwise, thanks for joining, and have a good rest of XR Kaigi.
Mr. David, thank you for your wonderful talk. 皆様ご清聴ありがとうございました。エキスポ4階にて AWE ブースがございます。ご質問やご相談などはこちらにお越しください。15時20分から5道ゲームエンジンの最新動向と実践 XR 開発です。引き続き XR 会議をお楽しみください。